The setting is December 1944, in the frozen, jagged forests of the Ardennes. A captured Oberleutnant of the 12th SS Panzer Division sits in the back of a canvas-topped American truck, his hands numb, his stomach a hollow ache of turnip soup and dry rye bread. He has been told for years by Dr. Goebbels that the United States is a decaying society, a nation of soft civilians whose cities are being leveled by U-boats and whose people are starving. The truck rounds a bend, and the officer's eyes widen. Stretching as far as the mist allows are thousands of GMC CCKW trucks, bumper to bumper, headlights dimmed, but engines roaring with a mechanical health he hasn't heard in years. He sees crates of fresh oranges, mountains of white flour, and soldiers eating chocolate bars as if they were common dirt. He looks at his own tattered uniform, then at a pile of discarded, empty tin cans labeled Spam. In this moment, the ideological shield shatters. It isn't the Sherman tanks or the P-47 Thunderbolts that break his spirit. It is the realization that while Germany struggled to feed its horses, America was feeding the world. To understand the sheer magnitude of the shock felt by German soldiers in 1944, one must first look at the deteriorating reality of the Third Reich's domestic and military front. By the middle of the war, the image of the sleek mechanized blitzkrieg that had swept through France in 1940 was a fading memory. Inside Germany, the Total War Decree of 1943 had stripped the civilian economy to its bare bones. The German people were living on a diet dominated by ersatz, substitute goods. Coffee was made from roasted acorns or chicory. Bread, known as Kommissbrot, was a dark, heavy mass often stretched with sawdust or potato flour to increase its volume. For the average lancer on the front lines, the dream of a hot, nutritious meal had been replaced by the grim reality of the iron ration. A hard biscuit, and a tin of questionable meat paste. The German logistics system was a paradox of high technology and medieval tradition. While the world marveled at the Tiger tank and the V-2 rocket, the vast majority of the Wehrmacht's supplies were moved by muscle. Between 1939 and 1945, Germany utilized a staggering 2.7 million horses. In the mud of the Eastern Front and the steep terrain of Italy, the German war machine clattered along at the pace of a walking animal. This reliance on animal transport wasn't just a tactical choice. It was a symptom of a desperate shortage of oil and rubber. Every gallon of synthetic fuel was prioritized for the panzers and the Luftwaffe, leaving the infantry to starve or scavenge. By 1944, the German soldier was fighting a 20th century war with 19th century mobility, convinced by state propaganda that the Allies were in an even worse state of deprivation. Propaganda Minister Joseph Goebbels had spent years crafting a narrative of American weakness. The German public was told that the United States was a mongrel nation, incapable of discipline, and that the U-boat blockade in the Atlantic had brought the Americans to the brink of famine. Newsreels in Berlin showed staged footage of breadlines in New York and claimed that the arsenal of democracy was a hollow shell. German soldiers were taught to believe that even if the Americans managed to land in Europe, they would be green troops, poorly supplied and lacked the stamina for a long campaign. This carefully constructed delusion was the only thing keeping many German units motivated as the Allied pressure mounted from both the East and the West. However, the reality across the Atlantic was the complete opposite of the Nazi narrative. While Germany was recycling scrap metal from park fences, the American industrial machine was entering a state of hyperproduction. The United States wasn't just building weapons. It was building an entire lifestyle that could be exported to the front lines. The American soldier was the best fed, best clothed, and most mobile combatant in human history. For every one German truck, the Americans were producing 10. For every ton of German horse fodder, the Americans were shipping thousands of tons of high-calorie processed rations. The stage was set for a psychological collision. When the master race finally met the decadent Americans, the first thing they would notice wasn't the caliber of the rifles, but the quality of the bread. As the German logistical spine began to crack under the weight of two-front attrition, the United States was orchestrating the greatest industrial mobilization in human history. To the planners in Washington and the workers in Detroit, the war was not just a battle of ideologies. It was a problem of moving mass. The Arsenal of Democracy was a title earned through the sheer, unrelenting output of the American factory floor. In 1944 alone, American factories were producing a new airplane every 5 minutes, and a new ocean-going vessel every day. But the true genius of the American war effort lay in the deuce and a half, the GMC 2.5-ton truck. This vehicle became the heartbeat of the Allied advance, a mechanical beast of burden that required no rest, no fodder, and could carry more weight than a dozen horse-drawn wagons combined. This industrial surge created a surplus that was inconceivable to the European mind. While Great Britain and the Soviet Union were fighting for their very survival, the United States was the only belligerent nation capable of increasing its civilian standard of living while simultaneously fighting a global war. This surplus cascaded down to the individual GI. The American military didn't just provide its soldiers with ammunition, it provided them with comfort. The Quartermaster Corps was tasked with a mission that seemed absurd to the German High Command, maintaining the morale of millions of men through food and luxury. This meant mobile bakeries that could produce thousands of loaves of fresh white bread daily, just miles behind the front lines. It meant the Red Ball Express, a massive convoy system of nearly 6,000 trucks that ran 24 hours a day to ensure the advancing armies never ran out of fuel or rations. By the summer of 1944, following the breakout from Normandy, the discrepancy in logistics reached a tipping point. The American army was burning through 800,000 gallons of gasoline every single day. To the German observers, who were siphoning fuel from downed planes just to move a single tank, this was not just a military advantage. It was a supernatural feat of organization. The Americans were not merely fighting a war. They were transplanting a high-consumption society onto the battlefields of Europe. Every U.S. division was backed by a tale of logistical support that spanned 3,000 miles of ocean and hundreds of miles of liberated territory. The American soldier was fighting with the full weight of the world's largest economy in his backpack. This logistical superiority was not a secret kept in the boardrooms of the Pentagon. It was visible on every road in France and Belgium. The sheer density of American equipment meant that for every mile of road, there were more U.S. vehicles than there were German soldiers to defend it. The German leadership, still clinging to the idea of Willensqualität, the quality of will, refused to accept that steel and calories could overcome the superior spirit of the Aryan warrior. They believed the American supply lines would eventually overstretch and snap. They waited for the Americans to run out of steam, but instead, the Americans simply built more ports, laid more pipelines, and sent more trucks. The realization was beginning to dawn on the lower ranks of the Wehrmacht. They weren't fighting an army, they were fighting a factory that never closed. The clash between the German and American logistical realities was not merely a matter of numbers. It was a profound cultural and psychological collision. For the German soldier, operating under increasingly desperate conditions, every calorie was a precious commodity, every gallon of fuel a strategic asset. Their experience of war was one of constant privation, where ingenuity was born from scarcity. They learned to improvise, to scavenge, to make do with what little they had. Their diet, often little more than dark bread, watery soup, and occasional ersatz coffee, reflected a nation under siege, a population that had sacrificed everything for the war effort. Their Kamesbrat, heavy and dark, was a symbol of shared hardship, a grim reminder of their collective struggle against overwhelming odds. In stark contrast, the American soldier arrived in Europe with an abundance that bordered on the absurd from a German perspective. Their rations were not just sustenance. They were a taste of home, a psychological link to the comforts of American life. The sea ration, though often derided, provided a high-calorie, balanced meal. But it was the availability of fresh produce, canned goods, and perhaps most shockingly, fresh white bread, that truly underscored the vast economic chasm between the warring nations. The mobile bakeries of the Quartermaster Corps were capable of producing up to 30,000 pounds of bread daily, baked with high-quality white flour. This wasn't just food. It was a symbol of limitless resources, a stark white testament to an unbroken supply chain stretching thousands of miles across the Atlantic. This nutritional war had a direct impact on the fighting capabilities and morale of both sides. A well-fed soldier has more stamina, clearer judgment, and higher morale. The American GI, consistently fueled by a high-protein, high-calorie diet, could sustain combat operations for longer periods, recover faster, and maintain a fighting spirit even under grueling conditions. The German soldier, on the other hand, was often malnourished, suffering from vitamin deficiencies and chronic fatigue. Their bodies, like their war machine, were running on empty, sustained more by ideological fervor and discipline than by physical nourishment. The very act of eating became a battle in itself for the Germans, a constant struggle against hunger and the limitations of their collapsing supply system. The sight of an American soldier casually discarding half-eaten rations, or the abundance of chocolate, cigarettes, and fresh fruit in their camps, was often too much for the beleaguered Germans to comprehend. These were luxuries that German civilians hadn't seen in years, let alone soldiers on the front line. The sheer waste from an American perspective was an unimaginable bounty from a German one. This disparity wasn't just about individual meals. It spoke to the fundamental difference in how each nation approached war, one through grim sacrifice, the other through overwhelming abundance. The psychological effect of this visible disparity eroded the foundations of German belief in their own superiority, fostering a deep sense of despair and the dawning realization of their inevitable defeat. Beyond the calories, the second angle of shock was the sheer mechanical reliability of the American war effort. To a German commander, a tank was a masterpiece of engineering, complex, heavy, and prone to breaking down after a few hundred kilometers. To an American commander, a vehicle was a tool that had to be replaceable and repairable in the middle of a mud-soaked field. The U.S. Army didn't just bring tanks, they brought a maintenance culture. Every armored division was followed by specialized recovery vehicles and mobile workshops that could swap an entire engine in hours. German soldiers, who often had to abandon their sophisticated Tigers and Panthers because of a broken fan belt or a lack of specialized grease, watched in horror as the Americans seemingly resurrected dead machines overnight. The third angle involves the humanity of logistics. When German soldiers were captured and sent to the rear, they expected the same starvation and brutality they had been told the degenerate Americans practiced. Instead, they entered the world of the American POW camp, a place that many German veterans later described as the most luxurious period of the war. They were served the same rations as their captors. For a man who had been eating sawdust-stretched bread for 2 years, the sight of a stack of fluffy, bleached white bread was almost religious. It was reported by U.S. Army censors that German prisoners would often hide pieces of white bread in their pockets, unable to believe that such a resource was truly unlimited, and that they would be fed again the next day. The final angle is the technology of the mundane. While Germany spent its genius on wonderwaffs, like the Me-262 jet or the V-2 rocket, America spent its genius on the jerry can, the forklift, and the pallet. The American ability to palletize cargo meant that a single crane could unload a ship in a fraction of the time. It took a German labor battalion to move boxes by hand. This efficiency created a wall of steel that was constantly moving forward. The German soldier saw this in the air as well, not just in the bombers, but in the transport planes like the C-47, which dropped tons of supplies to surrounded troops. The realization was bitter. Germany was fighting a war of individual heroics, while America was conducting a war of industrial inevitability. This systemic superiority meant that the American soldier could afford to be resourceful, because he was backed by a system that never ran dry. They didn't just have better weapons. They had a better way of war that prioritized the survival and comfort of the soldier as a means to victory. To the reactive German POV, every American luxury, from the filtered cigarettes to the standardized combat boots, was a message. We have more of everything than you have of anything. This psychological weight did more to dismantle the Wehrmacht's will to fight than any single artillery barrage. They weren't just being outfought. They were being outproduced, outfed, and outclassed by a nation they had been told was on the verge of collapse. The ultimate test of these two conflicting realities arrived in December 1944 during the Ardennes Offensive, better known as the Battle of the Bulge. Hitler's final gamble was predicated on a single, desperate hope that the German army could capture American fuel and food depots to sustain their drive to Antwerp. The German plan acknowledged their own logistical bankruptcy. They were literally betting the survival of the Reich on the abundance of their enemy. As the panzers rolled forward through the snow, they weren't just looking for tactical openings. They were hunting for cigarette camps and gasoline dumps. For the German soldier, the sight of a captured U.S. supply depot was like finding a legendary treasure. They found warehouses filled with chocolate, fresh coffee, and thousands of gallons of high-octane fuel that smelled like victory. But this temporary bounty only served to highlight the impossibility of their mission. In the crucial days of late December, the weather cleared, and the American logistical machine responded with a speed that defied German military logic. General George S. Patton performed a feat of organization that remains a textbook study in military schools. He pivoted the Third Army's entire logistical tail 90 degrees in the middle of a blizzard. Within 3 days, thousands of trucks, moving millions of pounds of ammunition and winter gear, were redirected to the Ardennes. The Germans, still struggling with horse-drawn carts that were freezing to the mountain roads, watched in disbelief as a river of steel flowed toward them. The Americans weren't just holding the line. They were drowning the German offensive in a flood of supplies. The turning point was not a single explosion, but the realization that the Americans could afford to lose. At the height of the battle, the German 1st SS Panzer Division, Leibstandarte, ran out of fuel just miles from a major U.S. depot. They could see the American trucks moving freely in the distance, while their own, invincible King Tigers sat motionless, becoming nothing more than expensive bunkers. The psychological blow was terminal. A captured German captain seeing a U.S. supply drop that included Christmas presents and fresh turkey for the besieged troops at Bastogne, reportedly broke down in tears. He realized that while Germany was sacrificing its children to hold a few miles of frozen forest, the United States was flying in a holiday dinner for its frontline soldiers. This disparity in resources meant that the American response was always proactive, while the German response was always reactive. When a bridge was blown, U.S. engineers didn't wait for horses. They brought in Bailey bridges on trucks and rebuilt the crossing in hours. When a unit was pinned down, American artillery didn't count shells. They fired time on target, barrages that saturated the German positions with more steel in 10 minutes than a German regiment saw in a month. The master race was being ground into the slush by a nation they had dismissed as shopkeepers. The sheer weight of the American logistical answer was transforming the Ardennes from a German breakthrough into a German graveyard. By early 1945, the German army was no longer a cohesive fighting force. It was a collection of hungry, desperate men retreating into a shrinking heartland. The final turning point came during the race to the Rhine. As the Allies pushed into the German borderlands, they overran the last major German supply hubs. What they found was a stark indictment of the Nazi war effort. Warehouses filled with medals and uniforms, but empty of food and fuel. Conversely, the German soldiers who surrendered in droves during this period were treated to a sight that finally broke the back of their indoctrination. As they were marched toward the rear, they were forced to step aside to make way for the Red Ball Express and its successors, a literal conveyor belt of American industrial might. The moment of total psychological collapse occurred when German units witnessed the American bridge of ships, extending into the very heart of the continent. At the Remagen Bridge and subsequent crossing points, the Americans didn't just cross the water. They brought a civilization with them. Within 48 hours of securing a bridgehead, U.S. forces had laid pipelines across the river bed to pump gasoline directly from the French coast to the German front. They had established field hospitals that were better equipped than Berlin's finest clinics and bakeries that produced bread so white it looked like bleached linen to the soot-covered Germans. For a Wehrmacht soldier who had been told that American cities were in ruins, seeing 10,000 trucks, brand new, well-maintained, and laden with meat, was the final, indisputable proof that the war was over. One specific event stands out in the archives of the 101st Airborne: the discovery of a German train that had been carrying supplies to the front. The Americans opened the crates to find luxury items meant for high-ranking Nazi officials, fine wines and silks, while the German soldiers nearby were starving. In retaliation, the American GIs opened their own sea rations and shared them with the local populace and the prisoners. The contrast was devastating. The German soldiers saw that their leaders had failed them, but more importantly, they saw that the American enemy possessed a generosity that could only come from a position of absolute, unshakable strength. The American ability to provide for both their army and their prisoners of war was the ultimate display of superiority. The climax was reached not when the last city fell, but when the German soldier ceased to believe in the possibility of victory. This shift was fueled by the 10,000 trucks. Every time a German squad looked at the road, they saw a fresh American unit, fully motorized, while they were forced to walk. They saw American soldiers using high-quality paper to light fires, while German orders were being written on the back of old envelopes. The American industrial juggernaut had moved from the factory floor to the German backyard, and its presence was a relentless, crushing weight. The arsenal of democracy had arrived, and it was carrying enough meat, bread, and ammunition to bury the Third Reich under a mountain of surplus. The immediate aftermath of the German collapse was a scene of logistical carnage that stretched from the Rhine to the Elbe. As the Thousand-Year Reich dissolved in May 1945, the landscape was littered with the skeletal remains of the Wehrmacht's pride. Thousands of Tiger and Panther tanks, machines that had once struck terror into the hearts of Allied tankers, sat abandoned on the roadsides, not destroyed by shells, but simply left to rust because their dry fuel tanks could no longer be filled. Beside them lay the carcasses of hundreds of thousands of horses, the literal horsepower of the German army, which had finally succumbed to exhaustion and starvation. The German retreat had been a slow, agonizing crawl through the mud, while the American advance had been a motorized sprint that never had to stop for breath. For the millions of German soldiers entering captivity, the first few weeks of peace were a period of profound sensory and ideological whiplash. The transition from the front lines to the American-run Rheinwassenlager, Rhine Meadow camps, was a descent into a reality they could not have imagined. While the sheer scale of the surrenders, over 3.4 million men in the final weeks, strained even American resources to the breaking point, the logistical disparity remained evident. German officers, who had spent years telling their men that American soldiers were soft, watched in silence as U.S. privates drove past in jeeps, wearing clean wool uniforms and smoking cigarettes that were manufactured in Virginia only weeks prior. The realization was bitter. The decadent Americans had not only won the war of guns, but they had won the war of standard of living. The psychological impact on the German populace was equally transformative. As the U.S. Army moved from an invading force to an occupying one, the 10,000 trucks that had carried shells now carried salvation. The American military began the monumental task of feeding a starving Europe. In cities like Munich and Frankfurt, where the population had been reduced to eating boiled cabbage and hunger bread, the arrival of American supply columns was a life-altering event. The same meat and white bread that had shocked the German soldiers now became the foundation of the post-war recovery. The Americans weren't just victors, they were the only people on the continent with a surplus. This period marked the total erasure of Nazi propaganda. It was impossible to believe in the master race, when a 19-year-old kid from Iowa could hand out more chocolate in an afternoon than a German worker saw in a year. The superiority of the German system had been exposed as a hollow facade, built on the backs of horses and the hunger of its people. The American system, which prioritized the luxury of logistics, had proven itself to be the more durable and powerful model. The war had ended with a total military surrender, but the aftermath was defined by a total cultural and economic surrender to the reality of American abundance. The sheer scale of the German surrender presented a challenge that no army in history had ever faced. Nearly 5 million German personnel had laid down their arms, and according to the Geneva Convention, they had to be fed. The American response was a final, staggering display of the arsenal of democracy. In the months following VE Day, the U.S. military transformed its combat supply lines into a massive humanitarian pipeline. The same Liberty ships that had carried Sherman tanks were now filled to the hulls with grain, dried milk, and canned meats. The German POWs, many of whom expected to be executed or starved in retaliation for the Holocaust and the brutality of the Eastern Front, found themselves instead standing in lines for American rations. In the prisoner camps, the white bread shock became a documented phenomenon. U.S. Army medical officers reported that German prisoners were initially suspicious of the white bread, believing it was bleached or chemically altered because they hadn't seen flour of that quality in over a decade. When they realized it was simply standard-issue American bread, the psychological surrender was complete. Interviews with captured generals revealed a consistent theme. They realized the war was truly lost not when the Soviets reached Berlin, but when they saw the American garbage. To the Germans, the fact that Americans could afford to throw away half-eaten tins of meat or discard worn-out tires rather than patching them was the ultimate sign of a civilization that could not be defeated. This abundance also laid the groundwork for the Marshall Plan. The infrastructure the Americans had built to win the war, the ports, The pipelines and the trucking networks became the skeleton of the European recovery. The 10,000 trucks didn't stop. They just changed their cargo from ammunition to reconstruction materials. The German people, who had been told that America was a land of chaos and poverty, saw instead a nation so organized and wealthy that it could afford to feed its former enemies, while simultaneously rebuilding its own civilian economy. The American soldier became a symbol of this new reality. A man who carried a Hershey bar in one pocket and a spare clip of ammunition in the other. By 1946, the German military machine had been entirely dismantled, but the American logistical machine had become the new global standard. The Wehrmacht's reliance on horses and willpower was relegated to the scrap heap of history, replaced by the American model of total industrial mobilization and motorized logistics. The war had proved that in the 20th century, the nation with the most trucks, the most calories, and the most reliable supply chain would always emerge victorious. The German soldiers returned to their homes with a story that would be passed down for generations. The story of how they fought with everything they had, only to be overwhelmed by a nation that had so much meat and white bread that it didn't even know how to be hungry. In the final accounting of World War II, history often remembers the sweeping maneuvers of generals and the thunder of the front lines. But the true story of the conflict's end lies in the silence of the German soldier as he watched a single American supply convoy pass him by. The war was not just won by superior tactics or individual bravery. It was won by the sheer, overwhelming weight of the American assembly line. The 10,000 trucks were more than just vehicles. They were the physical manifestation of a society that had mastered the art of the impossible. For the German Lancer, the sight of meat and white bread in the middle of a wasteland was a moment of profound clarity. It was the moment they realized that they hadn't just been fighting an army, but an entire industrial civilization that could provide its soldiers with the comforts of home while waging total war across an ocean. The myth of the master race was dismantled not by a manifesto, but by a logistical system that never ran out of fuel, never ran out of food, and never ran out of resolve. Ultimately, the American way of war changed the world forever. It proved that in the modern age, the ultimate weapon isn't a secret rocket or a heavier tank. It is the ability to sustain a human being with the full resources of a continent. As the dust settled over the ruins of Europe, the image of the horse-drawn wagon fading into history was replaced by the roar of the American engine. It was a victory of steel, a victory of calories, and a victory of a nation that believed its soldiers deserved the very best the world could offer. The bread of victory had been baked in Detroit and Pittsburgh long before it reached the Rhine, and its taste was something the world would never forget.